Welcome to the Into AI Safety podcast, where we discuss the challenges facing the field of AI safety and those who work within it. This show aims to provide the foundation and resources needed to get up to speed on safe and ethical AI. As always, I am your host, Jacob Hames. During the podcast, you may hear this sound, which denotes that I have included at least one link related to the content that preceded the sound. The purpose of this is to allow for citations and providing resources without breaking the flow of conversations. As per usual, items mentioned during asides will have links in the show notes as well. Hey everyone, it's your favorite guy that needs not one but two podcast outlets to discuss AI. Today, I'm joined by Alistair Lowe-Norris, and let me tell you, this guy's credentials are stacked. He is currently the co-founder and chief responsible AI officer at Iridius, a company focused on helping others build and deploy agentic AI, which is compliant with external and internal requirements. On top of that, he was the Chief Change Officer for Microsoft. He earned the President's Lifetime Achievement Award from President Joe Biden in 2023, and most importantly, he also has a podcast called the Agentic Insider, which I listened to quite a bit in preparation for this interview. I found it to be a great resource, not just for this interview, but also for getting a better understanding of how a very different group of people think about AI. In this episode, Alistair and I focus on the idea of responsible or trustworthy or safe or pick your favorite adjective AI, how compliance with specific standards is already being mandated in some cases, the consolidation of power that we're seeing play out among a few large tech companies, and the importance of narrowly scoping systems for ensuring safety. Although some of our takes do differ to varying extents, we had a great time discussing the future of AI, and I feel reassured that at least some companies working on AI solutions have people like Alistair working towards more responsible deployment of this hype-tastic tool. Similarly to last time, I put an extended version of this episode on the Kairos.fm Patreon. If you're interested in getting even more content, you can listen for only $2 per month. With that, let's get into it with our first ever guest that's also a host of their own podcast, Alistair Lowe-Norris.
Hi, my name is Alistair Lowe-Norris.
Awesome. So, in one sentence, what is trustworthy AI and why do you think it's important?
I think trustworthy AI is about having AI that is three things: ethical, safe, and good for people and good for the planet. And I think it's super important because we need to make sure that as we continue to evolve on this great world of ours, that we have a set of AI that is safe and trustworthy, okay, and acts for the benefit of humanity rather than against it.
Gotcha. All right. So, yeah, it's great to have you on. So, I was reached out to by you because you also have a podcast called the Agentic Insider. And I watched a good bit of these, prepping to have this conversation. And one question you ask every time to all of your guests is, what's the future you're building for? Before you answer that question, I first want to know, why do you ask this? What is it that you're trying to get out of this question?
I think we ask, what future are you solving for? Because we're really passionate about finding out what people are passionate about. What is it that's driving them forward? I mean, everybody has a day job, but that may not be the reason that they're pushing forward. So, what future are they looking to create? What are they solving for? What are the problems and the challenges that they see that in their life they're trying to help move forward? It could be personal, it could be professional, it could be something philanthropic. It entirely depends on where their passions lie. But I think this is a great question to pick things out. And this was my co-host, Philip Swan, that came up with this. And really, I think it works extremely well as a question to sort of draw people out and find out what's relevant to them. I think it's really the same answer to what are we doing with trustworthy AI. I mean, the future that we're solving for is an AI that is ethical, safe, and good for people, good for the planet. It's a focus on driving AI forward in a humane way that ensures that it is good for people and good for the environment.
So let's take a step back, maybe, just to understand more about who you are and how you got to where you are now. Obviously, that is like you have a lot of work that you've done that's quite impressive. And so, maybe what are some of the pivotal moments for you during that process to getting to, your current position and working on AI in this way?
Sure. I mean, I think so. So I'm currently the chief responsible AI officer for Iridius. Okay. I stepped into this because I'd led work at Microsoft around responsible AI before I had left. So I had a career at Microsoft that spanned from the 90s all the way through to about 3 years ago. And 23 years at the company, most recently the chief change officer. And so I focused on large scale change and transformation at the company. My career's focused on that transformation and change, but it's the human and people side of change. So yeah, I mean, I go back into the 90s, and I was responsible and helped drive and ship products for things like SharePoint that people may have heard of, and things like that. But at the end of it, change and transformation only comes from the human side. And so, it's easy when you want to drive a change, whether that's building software, shipping it, having customers adopt it, or ultimately, making large changes in the world at large. But it's easy if it's just you and I, because we can go out, we can have a chat, and I can, and I have an ability to be able to persuade you to be able to change the behavior and the way you do things. And for me, I think what was pivotal was going into the 90s. I was working with the Ministry of Defence in the UK. I was working with the Ministry of Defence, and they had a need to be able to roll out a completely new approach to technology in the across the organisation. And when they were doing that, they wanted to create a sort of a modern office, a mock-up office of what the office of the future could look like. And people would be able to come and be able to do certain user scenarios and so on it. And they called it the Improved Ways of Working, or the iWow team. Okay, and they built out this model office, and they had all of these fun things to do. And it was at that point that we realized that the way we were trying to drive this from a project management perspective was very different than we were needing to change user behavior, because people were used to the way they were working, and they didn't really want to work in the new way. And so they had, it's the same thing. If I tell you to cross your arms, you will cross your arms a certain way. If I tell you to cross your arms the other way, that's awkward, and you don't want to do it for very long. And so most people don't rush towards change. They're happy with where they are. And I think it was during that sort of iWow project and working with Microsoft and the Ministry of Defense that it was very clear that we needed to affect the human side of change far more than we'd ever really done on projects in the past. And they had these things called enterprise agreements. And the enterprise agreements was laid out where every 3 years you would work with your enterprise customers, and they would re-sign the agreement, hopefully with more users and more software that they had before. And actually the number of users was going down, so we were making less money. So the question was, okay, what are we not doing that we should have been doing? Why are they not using the software? I mean, we love it. Why aren't they loving it? And
Yeah.
so it suddenly became something where we realized that in order to drive adoption of software and use it, there had to be some sort of engine to be able to push this forward. And that engine was change management. And I don't mean
Okay.
the technical change management, I mean the human side of it. And so I think that was some of these big pivotal moments in my career, I think, have actually been around understanding the psychological behavior around change,
Hmm.
and the neuro capacity of people to change, and how to drive large scale change and transformation for people, and how to nudge behavior of individuals forward, to be able to move things forward in that way. And I think it's the same with AI. Okay, it's
Okay.
how do
So
you drive it in that way?
I guess the, there are a couple things I wanted to pick apart from that. I guess the first one is you mentioned you were working with Microsoft as the chief change officer, and we'll get into the change officer bit in a second. But during the past, 2 decades, essentially, which saw more or less the adoption of the internet, by and large, like it was already there, but now it is everywhere. It saw the rise of big data. It saw moving to the cloud. How does AI differ from some of these previous more significant changes, like big data or moving to the cloud? And how is it the same? And what are lessons maybe that we can take and move and bring into this AI space as it's developing?
Okay, so I mean, the three things. One, it's a change like any other. It's a tool. Okay, I know everyone around the world is super excited about it, but it is another tool. Okay,
Yeah.
and so it's a case of, okay, now we have a spanner or a screwdriver, and we didn't have those before. So now we can do things that we've never been able to do necessarily. But I think that the fundamental difference with AI is the speed. Okay,
Hmm.
and everyone, the changes are happening faster. They are not going to slow down. What is currently under development but has not yet been released are versions ahead of where people are seeing right now. So the tools that are released out there that are in the public domain um, every single leap forward in terms of foundation models and some of these pieces are significantly far ahead. They are, they're more than evolutionary. They're revolutionary, and these fundamental transformations are coming much faster than people will think they do. And to that extent, if we take they could take a standard model that's out there. Maybe it's version 3, version 4, version ChatGPT 5, for example. There are there are model builders out there who are 4 versions ahead, each of which is fundamentally, arms race different than the previous versions. And so
I
when
guess
you
I would push back against that a little bit, based on just like how I'm understanding the system, because people have been saying that since essentially GPT-3 came out, right? That, oh well, the thing that's being worked on internally is much better, and that it's so much further ahead. People were saying that 6 months ago, a year ago,
Sure.
and what we got was GPT-5, which was kind of a dud compared to the leap forward that we saw from 3 to 4. When it comes to trashing or fawning over new models, I like to be a little bit more thorough than the standard people are saying it's bad, or good, or game changing, or etc. So I did some digging. One thing basically everyone agrees on, who aren't just mindlessly creating tech enthusiast content, is that the release of GPT-5 was totally botched. And you can find the takes of various prominent writers who are both positive and negative about the model in the show notes. To briefly cover the popular discourse reasons, the reason this was a dud, it was massively overhyped. Surprise, surprise. And the general public likes more sycophantic AI, and the abrupt removal of GPT-4 caused consumer unrest. I don't love that, but let's move on for now. Some defenders of the model have decided that this seemingly backwards progress is actually just a cost-saving measure thanks to the router, which is necessarily part of the non-API query infrastructure. I guess I see it more as the marketing story failing as a result of the narrative they've been leaning on for a year beginning to creak, but, that is just me. Well, it's not just me, but you get it. I also see that there is maybe a disconnect between what's being stated and like where these systems are going to go, and then what we actually see manifest.
I think it depends on what you use it for. Okay,
Okay.
so I think that some of the directions that the models are going means that the I guess the diversity of use cases and the breadth of capability that AI is going to provide is going to be significantly greater, that people will see in the home as well as they would see, in their business or even in a manufacturing factory or something.
I mean, I cannot overstate this. I would love to have a robot do my laundry for me. I hate doing laundry. um, but there aren't systems that are scoped for this, right? They're much more general.
You're now really, from an AI safety perspective, you're absolutely nailing this. So take for example, so you now have a domestic helping robot. Let's create a hypothetical scenario, and it's
Okay.
capable of being able to cook meals, and it's be able to put on the laundry into a washing machine and a dryer and so on, and it's capable of looking after a baby. At some point, the question is, did it put the baby in the washing machine? Okay, did it put the laundry in the frying pan? Okay, the more of these domains that you add to it, the more complex that you make it, the more the operating areas that it needs to work in, and the domains, okay, become so much greater. And then the question is, okay, where are the safety guardrails on all of this as well? Okay, and so I agree with you. The breadth of use cases becomes significantly problematic as you expand them. I think that there are companies out there that are trying to take a step in that direction where they're saying, what if it's funny when you think about it, when you take a step back, there are so many companies right now that are clearly shedding staff in call centers worldwide because they can replace them with AI-based chatbots. And so the idea is, how many people can we fire today, okay, through, because we've now got all this wonderful technology that will help. And I think, if we park that to one side, suddenly there are conversations that are happening where you're saying, what if we put a robot in the home, but it wasn't using an AI to actually run the intelligence side of it? What if it was actually connected to a person who was certified in childcare, or certified as a chef, or certified as a domestic help, or elder care, these sorts of things? And then what you're doing is you're almost using it as a movable system that is connected to a human at all times, that is capable of providing that care. Yes, AI augmented, but then the domain question comes, okay, it's only scoped to used for a particular domain. So potentially the domain changes depending on the actual human that is connected to it. And all they're doing is sort of remotely channeling their personality and their requirements into this device. And they are, remotely working it like a drone that has more capabilities. So now it's not completely autonomous, okay, and we're not into Cyberdyne systems, but we are into a stepping stone where the AI is allowing it to be able to pick up things, move things, and so on at the command of the drone operator. But it's all completely interactive with the person at the other end. So it is human to human, but through an automated device. That sort of conversation is happening as an intermediary to try and get past the domain conversation.
Okay, so if that's happening, so I wasn't aware of this, but this essentially sounds like, I mean, in like the sci-fi equivalent is like you go, you jack into some sort of like system, and then you are in an avatar, right? Like this is essentially Avatar,
Sure,
but a little bit more low
exactly right.
tech.
No, you're quite right. But I mean, we don't have parallels because we've seen them in sci-fi for years in that respect. But Avatar is exactly that. You are jacking into another body, okay, and now you are controlling that body and doing what that body is allowed to do. So then the question that you and I have now is, okay, AI safety, what's it allowed to do? How far can it go? What can it do? Okay, and how what are the guardrails associated with that?
Well, and then there's also the last thing, which is what's the value add of doing that? Because if it's just a one for one, then as in one person is controlling one robot, um, there in some cases is some marginal value add, like you can reduce, I guess, transportation costs for the person. So let's say you're, trying to create a system that would help the elderly. If they all have, robots in their home, and then a person can go into like different systems, you can potentially help them. But that is also like maybe creates a sense of false security for those people, because that person can't always be there. And I guess that's one thing that is a concerning aspect to me. Is it seems like the value add for a company in this scenario is that you can devalue the human labor of uh, the people in the location that I guess you care about, in terms of your customer, by using people from somewhere else instead that have lower cost to you. So you're saying, okay, well, we don't want to pay for the people that live in, let's say, New York, or in the U.S. even, but instead we want to pay a lot less money, and so we'll just, do that, and that then removes, you know, a lot of value and from the people who are already doing that job, because they can no longer get paid as much because the threat is, oh well, we can just use this other system that costs a lot less.
And that's where we're into the call center situation of, what we will do is we will outsource the call centers in the United States to places that can provide that service much more cheaply. And then it's the same situation with now we'll outsource that service entirely to AI. And this is the same thing. How can we provide support? The question really, and I think this is really why, AI needs to be good for people and good for the planet, is there a way of being able to augment the services that already exist? So what we're really doing is talking about a fundamental replacement of service, or providing a service where it doesn't exist at the point of care being needed. What if we were able to augment it? What if we were able to provide additional care, okay, through service and units like this, okay, where that care was not possible all of the time?
I guess when we take the example of call centers, what I see happening is we have call centers, and previously, I mean, fundamentally, call centers are something that is expected of companies, but they do not want to do it, right? This is something that they are essentially required to do by convention. But if they can reduce the cost of customer service as much as possible within that convention and still sort of be seen as, doing what is okay as a provider, they will. And so what happens is the AI comes in and is quote unquote replacing, people who are doing this, but the system gets worse. And so instead of it being like some sort of augmented thing, we now have, it's a pain in the ass to talk with a human at a pharmacy in like 50% of pharmacies, because they require you to go through this like 5-step process of verifying that you don't want the things that they think you want, when you could just talk to a person originally or something like that. As I mentioned, I've experienced this a number of times, and apparently I'm not the only one. A study from April 2025 titled Deploying Chatbots in Customer Service, Adoption Hurdles, and Simple Remedies found that a key reason consumers choose not to use chatbots is an aversion to gatekeeper processes, when there is an initial imperfect service stage, potentially followed by a transfer to a second. In addition, many consumer surveys have shown that, at least in the United States, people would prefer humans, such as one from Gartner, which found that 64% of consumers would prefer their customer service providers were not AI-based systems. Despite this, customer service providers continue to aggressively pursue poorly thought out shifts away from providing customer service with humans. I'm not saying that I believe there's no value in integrating AI systems into customer service, but they need to prioritize customer agency and effectiveness of the created tools, not the naive minimization of cost per interaction. And that's a specific example from my life, but the important part is what I'm seeing is not that it's being made better.
Sure. I mean, I think I'd push back a little bit on the earlier comments that organizations or companies do not want to provide customer support. I think what companies want to do is they want to have customers who as far towards the raving fans, okay, end of the spectrum as they possibly can be. They want customers to be as happy as possible, because then they will use the service, become promoters, okay, and so on. And as part of that, they know that some people find it difficult to use, whatever the technology is or whatever the service is. And in order to do that, they have to provide support. So in some cases, I agree with you. It's a necessary evil. But I think that a lot of what companies have done up to this point is they have outsourced to large call centers that exist around the world, okay, especially trained for these purposes, okay, and they provide and they are designed to deal with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and so on. And In fact, quite a few of the tier one calls, in fact, it tends to be a much wider funnel at the top for tier one and a much narrower funnel at the tier three, because you have more people calling up for very simple questions where they might be able to find it online or they might be able to Google it, but they don't want to. They just want to call somebody and just have them tell them how to do it. And I think that there are opportunities to outsource that to more automated solutions. What we saw in the early days of this was AI chatbots that really can't answer the questions that people need. Okay, now we're getting to a point where there are AI systems that are able to answer it in a language of your choice, based off of a knowledge base that it's trained on. So if really the questions are mostly contained in an FAQ or similar, then that's something that you can triage out those questions and triage out those sorts of incoming support calls in a way that is much more easy now than it was 2 or 3 years ago, and providing an interactive experience that provides to customers the full fidelity that they need. I think that what that doesn't negate the need for a call center. It means that what you're doing is you want your call center and the humans to focus on the hardest problems, the ones which are really challenging the customers. Not, I need a password reset, but I literally cannot make this thing work in the way that I need, and I'm starting to not be able to use the software to get the impact that I want out of it. That's a fundamental problem, and that's where I think the call centers and the customer support services will focus. That becomes an AI augmented solution with humans, okay, to be able to deliver the service. So the vast majority of the tier one calls, in some cases, if they are simple, easy to deal with, off of a knowledge base, and so on, are easier to replace, but not at the broader end of things.
Right. So I guess then this gets into sort of a fundamental issue I have with the AI space right now, in particular, is that to me, what seems to be happening is the select companies that have these models at the cutting edge are saying, "Oh, we'll just use our chatbot, like our general chatbot," and that's very costly, and it has a high failure rate relative to other potential solutions. So we could actually take the FAQ that you mentioned, use that as retrieval augmented generation, and using that for the sort of corpus that's being drawn from, and then have an intelligent routing system based on questions that are provided to the chatbot, and then it just pulls up the FAQ, and there's a little bit of a wrapper for natural language on it. Like, that is a much more specific targeted solution than just, oh, well, give it as context to the LLM and have it respond. But it's much more robust. And so what's your take on like why that's happening and how this is going to play out as well? Is something like what I just said going to be where people end up moving towards?
Yeah, I think you laid out the solution that's out there and available right now. I think that people have thrown, AI at anything, okay, and it's the same standard LLM. It's not super trained, and it's not able to do what's required, and it gives people a poor experience. Your approach with RAG, or also, and as context windows get so much larger, the need in some ways for being able to RAG something as opposed to just pointing it at an existing corpus of knowledge, and using its context window to understand it and create the relevant vectors and graphs out of it is much easier than it ever was in the past. But I think you're right. If you can pull that corpus of knowledge in using RAG or using context windows, and then provide a solution that has the capability to explain it, not just in a language that the person speaks, but at the complexity of the language. So some people speak the same language, but their use of that language is less sophisticated, for want of education, for want of where they're living, and so it needs to be able to meet them at the point of where they need it. So it needs to not only be able to explain it in a language, but it needs to explain technical things in non-technical ways to people who are not technical. To take an example, or it needs to talk about it in a fifth grade English level or a fifth grade whatever level, compared to speaking at a college level. And I think there's that sort of stuff that you can
Sure.
do. But I think your solution is exactly the way to push this forward and be able to do it, not just take a one size fits all approach.
So I this has been a very interesting conversation for me because I feel like each time you respond, I pick out something within the the previous thing that I want to build on more. So we'll get back to like some of the core things because I do want to hear more about sort of your experience with tech regulation. But in that comment that you just made, you mentioned that we need to talk, or sorry, the you mentioned that the system should be responding at an appropriate level, and in theory, that would work, but in practice, what we see is that performance changes drastically under these other circumstances. So, using African American dialects has demonstrated to tank performance on benchmarks much more significantly than just using broken English. So, how do we make sure that we're actually giving the same information, the same quality, the same accuracy across all of these different things? Similarly, low resource languages are demonstrated to be substantially less. Uh, LLMs have a much harder time performing well on benchmarks in those
I
languages.
think, of course,
Right.
that's true. Of course, that's true, and I think that that's a if we want to really live up to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to be able to meet people where they're coming from, and I think that current versions of this, to the point about things are going very fast, are not able to meet everyone equally and where they need to be met. I think that will come over time, but the answer to this is more investment in that and ensuring that parity occurs and that we don't just pick the major languages in the world to ensure that people can use those, and you become disenfranchised because you're unable to communicate in the language that it has been trained in. To your point as well, if you train it in Western ideals, which is where some of the models were trained, okay, then it is unable to recognize certain things from other diasporas, and I think that's a really fundamental issue, and equity must be brought, okay, to these foundation models. It's a serious, important problem.
So how do we do that? Like, do you have any thoughts on how we can secure that? Because currently, if you funding that, I guess, um, is very difficult because instead your like support just sort of goes to general capabilities improvement, and that's not actually helping this sort of problem that you just
Sure, but I
outlined.
mean, this is a very Western English, horrific mentality where it's like, if as long as we focus on that, that's where the money is, and that's not true. There are far more people who are not Western and English speaking, that can be served, okay, and that service can be delivered too. And I think it's a very biased way of viewing things. The answer to the question you're asking is investment. And the best way to be able to bring that investment about is with having a series of benchmarks, having a series of to some extent, philanthropic, organizations or advocacy organizations that are clearly saying these models are falling short in their ability to guide the impacts of these systems on society, specifically with groups of individuals, and it needs to be continuously played out. Okay, and you need to be able to some extent play the models off each other and say, it's great that Gemini has suddenly been able to meet these benchmarks far better than others, or it's great that OpenAI has suddenly been able to do something better over here. And then what you're doing is you're using healthy, capitalist competition in some ways to be able to drive this push in the right direction. But it has to be through advocacy, it has to be through benchmarks, and it has to be people holding the model builders accountable, because foundation models are going to be where it's coming from. The hyperscalers, the investment that they have have buying nuclear power stations and so on. It's these large organizations with the money, they're either going to succeed or fail on what they're investing in, and it's going to be these model builders that have to do it. So holding them accountable as much as possible is going to be crucial.
Well, okay, so I guess I I just don't quite see why the investment, like you're saying, the way to do it is investment, but wouldn't it make more sense to not invest in these companies if they're either going to do it or not going to do it? And all evidence seems to be pointing to them not
Sure.
doing it.
Let me clarify. Let me
Then,
clarify. When I'm talking investment,
yeah.
I'm saying it's up to the big foundation model builders, OpenAI, Google, and others, to invest in it, Microsoft, and so on. If they choose
Mm,
not to do that, then they will, not they should not receive, okay, the user support and the use of their service because they are failing to meet people where they're at. And I think that's the fundamental thing. So
gotcha.
if advocacy and benchmarks and so on and all of the sort of the political push drives in a certain direction, that's absolutely a way to be able to guide model builders to go in a particular direction. If they don't do it, then other model builders will step forward, okay, and other people who, because these techniques and the approaches are being either stolen slash democratized, and so other people understand now how to build models. There are ways where people will create solutions, okay, where it's possible to deliver the service that is necessary.
Okay. And then, yeah, I guess another thing is about democratizing AI. So this is something that uh, I care a lot about, and there are a lot of different ways to think about this. So I think, based on my understanding, looking at some of your work, is the main democratization of AI that you are referring to is the use, like accessible use of these systems, essentially. Um, but that sort of presumes that there is buy-in on the uh, initial level for like using or creating language models. To me, like, we need to build benchmarks. We need to assess these systems. While that is definitely, in has positives, it also presumes that I guess we want to do that in the first place. And I feel like that's not a conversation that has been
I
had.
think that's fair. And I think that what you're ending up looking at is saying that there are multiple ways to deal with this. Okay, one is through policy and regulation. Okay, and governmental laying down that in order for the good of our society and our community, it is crucially important for model builders and AI to meet these ethical requirements. And you can lay down that as part of it. And then you're in a constant battle with lobbyists, okay, on behalf of these organizations, okay, to stop hampering competition and to make things less regulated. But ultimately, regulation has a place absolutely in this, okay, because that's part of what government is supposed to provide. The second thing is that
Yeah.
we're staying away from the political conversation. That is generally where it's supposed to be. So regulation is one avenue. Another one is standards, international standards. So International Standards Organization, ISO, IEEE, other things like that are able to say that this is best practice for how to measure bias, systemic bias in an organization, how to ensure that every AI has an AI impact assessment to understand about there's a particular standard that everyone talks about called ISO 42001, and they talk about it because it's an auditable AI standard. But actually, when you look at it, it inherits from 70 other AI standards. Okay, and one of those is 42005, which talks about how for every single AI system in a company or an organization or in a country, you need to do an AI impact assessment, and that on the AI system, and that is to understand about how is it affecting particular groups and society as a whole, and how are you ensuring that those people are involved throughout the entire AI lifecycle from the initial concept all the way through design and then into implementation.
I definitely had all the context for these right at that moment and didn't have to look them up after the fact. But for those of you who can't spout off ISO standards by their 5-digit identifiers from the top of your head, here's what he's talking about. ISO's formal name is the International Organization for Standardization, and no, that isn't incorrect. Actually, the reason behind it is kind of interesting, but completely unrelated. ISO is a global organization that creates and maintains standards, essentially codified best practices, for a majority of global industries. ISO 42001 is special because it is a standard specifically made for AI management systems, which, as far as I can tell, just means using something labeled as AI in your workflow and managing that. Alistair noted that it was the first auditable standard for AI management systems, which really just means that it has requirements which either are or are not met. Based on what I can gather from the free online resources, because actually getting access to the standard requires you to pay like 250 USD, is that 42001 draws heavily from 27001, which concerns information security management systems. The most important difference being that 42001 was written specifically for AI systems, so it pays more attention to issues like bias and reliability.
So I think that there are ways of being able to put standards out there and best practices. Companies can completely ignore that. They absolutely can, which is where regulation and so on comes in. You're either going to make people pay in some way to force it, okay, or you either appeal to their better nature, okay, which isn't, which these are companies, they're not really in it for their better nature, they're in it for money for themselves and
Yeah.
shareholders, or you end up trying to push this down with regulation. And that the comment is, you either do it this way or we penalize you the other way. To that point of, if you take the EU AI Act, then we're talking about potentially, 7.5% of global revenue as an example.
Just a slight correction here. It's actually 35 million euros or 7% of total worldwide annual turnover, whichever is higher. That's pretty close for off the top of your head though, so we won't fault him for that.
These are significant amounts of money that people can get charged or fined for making mistakes or willfully making mistakes. So I think there's a balance here. Okay, guidance, standardization, recommendations. The our peers. Your peers are doing it. Why aren't you doing it? Advocacy organizations, and then regulation. All of these are sort of an intermixed set of things that can push organizations in that way. But ultimately, if let's pick a company, okay, let's say OpenAI isn't doing what is needed, but people are still paying it the money, then it's not really in its interest to continue moving in that direction. So you're 100% right. But I think it's a large different set of groups that all interlink to try and move this forward to be good for people and good for the planet.
Okay, so what you're saying, like the ISO 42001, 001, is like, it sounds great, and the 42005 as well, like that. These sound like reasonable, ways to go about it. But as you said, companies aren't doing this, really, at least from what I'm seeing. So what can we do to help push that? Is it just sort of vote with your wallet in this case, like don't use their systems, or is there more that can be done here?
So companies, if you were to ask companies a couple of years ago how much they cared about responsible AI, the answer would have been mostly zero. At
Yeah.
that point, I think that there is a significant move in that direction over the past 6 to 12 months, where it's becoming far more prevalent. And there are some companies that are they're intentionally moving in that direction, and others are paying lip service to it. So some people are saying, I'll do whatever the minimum bar that I can. This is Mike Crop in our organization would say that, I want to do the minimum amount of compliance and no more, because, it's all about compliance. You want to comply with the standards. You're not necessarily going to go wild with it. But compliance, it has to go beyond compliance. It has to be something where you live and breathe the way that you develop whatever service or product it is to ensure that if you're using AI, you're responsible throughout it. So it goes beyond that lip service. And to your point, companies have to embed it. I'll take an example here, and I'll keep using Microsoft because I was responsible and involved in the creation of it. But Microsoft has a huge gamut of responsible AI tools and policies that it publishes externally on how it internally develops its software and how it holds itself accountable, what its principles are, how it does AI risk assessments, how it does AI system impact assessments, all of these. About trying to think, around this time last year, around September last year, Microsoft cascaded those responsible AI standards down to its suppliers and said that if you are a supplier to Microsoft and you are using AI, and I don't care if you happen to buy one third-party AI tool and decided to use it in your delivery of a product or a service to Microsoft as a company where Microsoft is buying a support service, whether it's they're buying paper towels and napkins for use in the restrooms or the kitchens, or they're actually buying software that they use to respond to particular needs. Okay, Microsoft is now requiring those suppliers to complete an approach around responsible AI very heavily that procurement says you need to meet responsible AI standards. And these standards are extremely strict. They need to be AI red teaming. People have to have health and system monitoring. They need to do AI system impact assessments, okay, on their disenfranchised and potentially disenfranchised groups and publish it. They need to provide transparency notices. So procurement in a large organization like Microsoft, okay, mandated this a year ago. So all the suppliers have to meet this or they can't be a supplier anymore.
This one took a minute, but we got there eventually. So what Alistair is referring to is that Microsoft has suppliers, and to be one of those suppliers, you need to meet requirements outlined in the Microsoft Data Protections Requirements, or Microsoft DPR. Now, I'm not totally sure what these suppliers are supplying, but it seems to be covering a very wide space, so I don't think it's worth getting into. In September of 2024, Microsoft added multiple requirements to the DPR regarding AI management systems, which map to items within ISO 42001. It's worth noting that, at least for larger companies like Microsoft or Amazon, they get compliance certifications for specific products or services, not the entire company. For example, Microsoft currently has ISO 42001 certification for 365 Copilot, and Amazon has one for AWS. That being said, I couldn't find many companies, any companies really, other than these big tech companies, that were sharing the information about their certifications, and I have no clue how long the accreditation is supposed to last for. If it's anything like it is in healthcare, they'll let things go due to process drift over the course of the next year or two, which is the duration of the certification, and then they'll rein it in again when it comes time for the next audit. While no governments have singled out specific requirements for AI, there are a few domains which are beginning to expect ISO 42001 specifically, or requirements in line with the standard. According to explainers on this, the areas already seeing this are e-commerce, healthcare, and automated robotics, including autonomous vehicles. Although, do take that with a grain of salt, because the only people writing explainers on this are the companies that can be the auditors for it.
It's not the only company that is doing this. It was able to take that step because it had all of the standards that it used internally. You could argue, well, hang on a minute. What Microsoft just did was cause complete pain for all its suppliers because it said, okay, we've now decided to hold you as accountable as we're holding ourselves. And if you're only 3 women and a dog running a company and you're still using AI in the delivery of your service, suddenly you have to do all of these things that you didn't know you even needed to do. But take it from the other side, what Microsoft is saying is we guarantee that not only do we have a commitment to responsible AI, but all of our suppliers and vendors do as well in everything that they do. And Microsoft says that if you, as a supplier, so let's say Microsoft decides to hire ABC Corporation, and ABC Corporation uses AI, and ABC uses DEF. ABC has to hold DEF to the same standard, okay, and it must have contracts with them. Now, this has always been true. There's always been data protection agreements that said that we will obey GDPR and we will make sure that our subcontractors or sub-processors obey GDPR and things like that. Now it's gone more into security, privacy, data protection, and responsible AI. And Microsoft is an example of a company that's done that, but other companies are coming out with it as well. And so now we're going to see more and more procurement organizations who are going to expect their suppliers to meet these standards. And therefore, in order for their suppliers to meet the standards, the services those suppliers buy, even if it's from OpenAI, have to meet those standards. So suddenly, okay, all of these companies worldwide are going to be knocking on the doors of foundation model builders and saying, prove to me that you meet these requirements. Because if you don't meet these requirements, I can't use your services in the delivery of what I'm doing, and therefore I have to go to somebody else. So now suddenly I can't buy from you anymore. Now we're talking about enterprise, medium business, small business, true. We're not talking about consumer here, but ultimately this does make a difference. And I think that means that responsible AI needs to exist inside an organization well enough that they then turn it over and say, we're now going to hold our third parties accountable. And that's starting to happen more than it has in the past. And I think that's a big change we're going to see. AI ethics is going to be huge over the coming years. Huge.
It feels to me that what's happening is, the buck is essentially being passed to first. It's so Microsoft having these like responsible AI mandates is good, but there's so much like, how can we validate that those are happening? I guess in this case,
That's exactly right. I mean, take this as an example. So ignore AI for a moment. Okay. You want to be able to
okay,
prove that you know what you're doing with security. As an organization, you're a company and you want to say, I have good security credentials. If you're in America, you could go and get a particular an audit against something called SOC 2. It's done by the Association of CPAs. Everyone in America knows it because it's a very American certification that was created by the Association of CPAs, so CPAs could do these audits. If you go broader across the world, you tend to move into ISO 27001, 27001, and that's about SOC 2 is about 50% of what 27001 is. But if you either got SOC 2, type 2 certificate, or you got a 27001 audit, you had both of those, you are proving that you are meeting industry standards for security and cybersecurity, information security. If you wanted to prove that you were as good for privacy management, GDPR and California CCPA, CPRA, things like that, what you end up doing is getting something like ISO 27701. So you can get auditors to come in and say that you're meeting the best standards worldwide for doing this, and you're meeting regulation. It's the same sort of thing for responsible AI. Okay, 42001 and equivalent. You're coming along and saying you're meeting the EU AI Act. You're meeting these standards. So auditors are able to look at this and ensure that companies are doing all of the things that are required out there. And there are enough there are enough ways that companies can self-audit if they wish to do so. There's a particular paper that was published. It was published a couple of years ago, but it was republished by a lady called Sunny, who's a researcher out in Australia, and a group of others. And it put together the question bank for AI risk assessments. And it started out with something like 293 questions. I think when they published it again in January, there are around 245 questions now. But it basically consolidated Australia, the EU AI Act, some of the things from the Microsoft, and a host of others around the world. I think it was Singapore and Canada and some others. And it said, okay, here is a full question bank that if you answered these well enough, these 245 questions, you would have proven that you have taken every possible measure that you could in order to do the right things. Now, you still need the assets and the evidence to back it up, but at least if you could answer all these questions, you've thought about all the things that are necessary, and then you just actually have to do the things you said you were doing. And I think that there is enough of that guidance that's out there now that allows you to do responsible AI as an organization, and do it in the right way. I think that organizations are still not where we want them to be. I believe that if you're an organization that is doing responsible AI, you should be publishing this information very publicly on your website. And very few of them are doing that. There's a very big difference to me between transparency and openness. Openness requires disclosure. I think you should be proactively disclosing all of these things in a way that allows other people to build up their trust with you, rather than just saying, "Yep, we'll definitely be transparent. If you ask us, we'll tell you," which is where a lot of them are right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's pretty important now, especially with the other concerns around AI of like collapse of truth and the difficulty of building trust in the current state of, ubiquitous communication. Um, Being able to trust a company that I mean, that sounds. I don't know if I would ever go that far, honestly, because my model of a company is just profit maximizer. That's what they're made to do. Like, you can't fault them for that. That's the whole point. So, but as close to trust as you can get, with what they're sharing is not just saying, "Oh, well, if you asked, we'd tell you," but here is the information you need to know in order to evaluate this, without you having to ask for
Absolutely.
it. I think is, and I try to do that with like the podcast, for example, and like the show notes. I have all of my sources and stuff, but I think it's a lot of work too. Is the thing, and so it's hard to get people to do.
It is. This
Um,
stuff isn't easy. Okay, and
yeah,
to some extent as well, your point about, profit maximizer is absolutely true, but this is a necessary cost of doing business as we move forward. And I think as AI moves into the forefront and is used in every possible way that it is now being used and will be used in more, I think this has got to be something that becomes far more important. I think AI ethics and so on as a discipline, is going to become important, and maintaining and keeping, okay, those systems responsible as they grow and evolve is going to be crucial, because just because it was responsible today doesn't mean it's going to be responsible tomorrow. If these systems learn, then they are
right.
changing. And if they and the foundation models that are out there, it's great to be able to say that they need to be explainable, which is what the EU AI Act and others actually do. But in many ways, they're not explainable. You cannot understand, okay, exactly how a model came to a decision, okay, because of the way that it has been architected. So now what you have to get to is, it's not explainable, but it might be interpretable, which means that the decisions have to be understandable, and it needs to be designed so that they include comprehensible explanations to help humans understand how they came to that decision, even if the exact chain of thought is not possible. Because if you ask OpenAI how on earth it came to an answer, it can give you a chain of thought that is completely made up. Okay, it's not
Yeah.
absolutely how it came to it, and you can't know it.
I mean, we know what is happening within the model, right? Like we just fundamentally do know there are processes that are happening there. So if you go onto like the lowest level, we can
Yep.
understand it. But then also, and this goes more towards like my perspective, we could have just documented this and done good engineering in the first place. Like, we could have just designed it purposefully from the beginning, made the scope narrow, and then understood the process as we trained it. And we wouldn't be in this scenario. And so that is like, yeah, I guess one thing to push back on, because it makes interpretability, like, while interpretability is nice, explainability would be far better, and interpretability shouldn't be seen as a one for one
I,
substitute there.
I
I don't
completely
think.
agree. I completely agree. I mean, one of the principles at Iridius that we have is around interpretability and explainability, and the reason that we have that under the pillar of AI being ethical is because there are some things currently, because of the way the models have been designed and the information is impossible to get, as to you can't get
Yeah.
explainability.
And so I think this is a good then like sort of segue into how what we've discussed, especially what we just discussed, influences and informs Iridius and what you do at Iridius. What is it that you're doing? And how have you taken this sort of ethos and perspective and brought it into that work? Um, in this
Sure. I
case?
mean, Iridius is about, Iridius has 4 patents pending, focused on building safe and responsible AI solutions for customers. It has an approach where it wants to put a multi-agent system fabric together, okay, that allows customers to create AI solutions, okay, in days rather than months, but build them in a way that they are compliant with external regulations, external standards, and internal policies and standards by design. And the fundamental thing that's different with what Iridius is doing is that there's a huge issue out there where people are trying to build kitchen sink agents that have everything inside them. To your point earlier, you take
Yeah.
one model and you make it do 700 different things. And when you have things like this and you have, industry luminaries and leaders standing on stage and saying we're going to have, potentially dozens of agents all working together, and then there's this orchestrator that brings them all, and it has to make sure that they're all talking correctly. We did it very differently. We took an approach that said, why don't you take the work that needs to be done and break it down to the smallest possible units? Okay, the same way that NASA did things with the Apollo approach, because you literally did it in that way. So it's not deterministic. It's definitely still AI. But what we're saying is, why don't you have agents that are small? Okay, and so we have a distributed series of small agents, but that means that you can build a system with millions of agents, billions of agents, all running and orchestrating together, okay, to be able to build solutions. But the attack surface and the concern around any individual agent is much smaller because its functionality and its requirements are very, very narrow. It has a very defined role, but it also has a set of ethical behaviors and guidelines, and it has a set of entitlements, and those entitlements guide what it is allowed to do. And so it's about making sure that these agents are super focused, super tight, very small, and then because of that, the attack surface is smaller. It allows them to self-organize, and at the same time, you're able to monitor the safety of these things much more easily because they're not so monolithic and so complicated, that it becomes a difficult task. That I think is
Doesn't that cost so much
not
money?
really, because these agents are quiescent until they need to be activated. So if you take a bank, for example, that has, I don't know, 15 million accounts, and you need, one of them's a savings account, one of them, 15 million customers, each of which has a savings account, a checking account, and something else. So let's say there's three different accounts, 45 million accounts. You could have literally an agent for every single one of those accounts. I'm not just simplifying this. So now we've got 45 million agents, but
Mhm.
not all of them are running. They're only running when something arrives. So you've got a transaction coming in. So the agent
Okay.
wakes up. Okay, so it's hydrated. It does whatever it needs to do, and then it's dehydrated again, and it shuts down. So now you're running these sorts of things. Okay, and you end up.
So you do have whatever hundreds, thousands of agents, but it's not that you're running them in parallel. It's
No.
that you're running them when they need to be used, and then you're moving it away. So every agent has its own very defined box that it sits
Yeah,
in,
but absolutely.
basically.
But your point about explainability is crucially important because I know what that agent is. It has a transparency card. Okay. It clearly says what the model is going to do, how it's going to work, exactly what its inputs are, what its outputs are. And clearly, this is exactly how it works.
And this also ties into, I think, possibly the question that I beforehand was most interested in discussing with you in depth, which was in your podcast at one point you mentioned once you have a system that is just compliant, or rather that just is compliant, then you don't need to worry about safety needs
Ah,
anymore.
I think that's not the best way that I could have phrased things. What I think I mean is if you have a system that is meeting the current standards, the best practices worldwide for safety with AI, and you are ensuring that it is compliant as it currently stands, then you know that you are as safe as you can be right now. What you need to do is ensure that you are staying ahead of the safety game constantly. So safety changes, the needs change. We might be 100% cybersecurity compliant right now, but tomorrow we might be 94% because something else has come out. And so you have to be able to ensure that safety, and in fact, explainability, all of these things, fairness, are constantly moving targets. You need to be able to ensure that you are compliant with these constantly changing standards, regulations, and targets. And you do that by ensuring that you introduce these new standards and approaches into the existing system and require it to step up to meet that compliance. What that may mean is that you are retiring versions of agents that exist and replacing them, in a stepwise way, okay, very, very quickly, but even so in a stepwise way, with better versions of those agents that are now compliant with regulation 1.73, where they were previously compliant with regulation 1.72 or whatever it is. So I think that what I should have said and better would have said is, I think that once you have a system that is compliant, you need to continue to worry about safety, but you need to make sure that the safety needs are continually being addressed minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, as new information is provided, and the system has to be able to adapt to that while still maintaining functionality. And that's something that self-orchestration and all the rest of it will help with, but ultimately it can give you a little bit more confidence that you are staying compliant with whatever the best practices are worldwide. And some that, standards take 2 to 3 years to launch. It doesn't mean you can't be compliant with something that isn't yet current, as long as it's a great way of being able to make sure you're staying ahead of the game.
Okay. And then I guess to close off like the thought on standards, you've been working with standards and regulation like for a long time. What actually happens when standards aren't met?
Sure. I mean, I think there's two things. I think if we take regulations and we take standards as two separate things. So if you're not compliant with regulations, you can be
Okay.
fined up the wazoo, assuming that the
Right.
regulator has defined fines. Okay. And so, the EU AI Act has great fines. The Colorado and Utah one have minor fines that a company that's very large would look at and treat as a minor mosquito bite. Okay, that it really wouldn't care
Yeah,
about.
cost of
Exactly.
doing
Yeah,
business.
exactly. So then if you're hoping that companies will be ethical, I think that's a problem. You have to be harsher with the penalty in order to ensure that compliance becomes important inside the organization. So let's put regulation to one side for the moment. Okay, if
Okay.
you take standards, nobody is pushing. Nobody, it's not true, but most organizations are not pushing to comply with standards, except nobody goes along and says, normally, I want to be 23% compliant with security standards. Okay, because it feels like that's probably a bad idea. Okay, you almost certainly want to be
Yeah.
as compliant as you possibly can be. And so then the question is whether you want to be audited or not to demonstrate compliance, but you can still be compliant even if you're not audited. It's in the procurement organizations that actually drive this. So inside, if your company wants to be compliant with a standard, okay, then it's either going to be audited or not. If it's not going to be audited, then it's entirely up to your own organization to do what you think is right and implement those standards, but you don't have any outside organization that is checking it. And any outside auditor, in order to get that outside audit, there need to have been an internal audit done by somebody who understands it well enough to ensure compliance before you put it in front of an outside auditor. So to taking it from a case of, tier one, where we're saying we're gonna do the best we can, we're gonna implement these standards, but we're not going to check ourselves against it. That's tier one. Tier two is now we have an internal audit team that's going to ensure that we keep compliant with it and the new standards as they change. Step three says now we're going to have an external audit that proves that we got the little badge that says yes, we passed the test and we're lovely for the next 3 years. And audits, by the way, have to be redone every year anyway. But then the last one is if you're doing all that, then take the procurement organization and require all your suppliers to do it too. Now you're asking all of your suppliers to have the audit badge or to go and find an auditor who can tell you you're as good as that, and provide that validation back. And I think that then suddenly allows you to sort of mature as an organization. Now you're compliant. If you're at level 4, you're compliant as an organization at level 3 because you've been audited externally. Level 4, you're now holding all of your suppliers to the same standard. Now suddenly you're doing, in theory, the best you can. But then the next question is, okay, just like we said with AI, these regulations change, so people have to be ahead of it. Just because you're compliant with a standard from 2012 doesn't really help if it was updated in 2021. And so those sorts of things really do matter. So I think there's a level of taking those steps up the tiers to demonstrating that you're not only compliant. I think that the best organizations go beyond compliance to embedding it in their fabric. So we would say in Iridius that we're born out of safe and responsible AI. It's in everything we do, from every single step along the way, and that fundamentally changes the way that we do business because we will not do things if it doesn't meet those standards. So we publish our 3 pillars and responsible AI principles on the website, and ultimately everything we do is built out of that. I think that's a fundamentally different way to do business, but it requires the CXOs level to actually drive this with accountability and resources in order for it to happen.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. Because I feel like you hear about standards, but it's not clear, what is the actual mechanism that is encouraging.
Yep.
So I then want to do a couple of questions just as like closing. What is your hottest take regarding AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the robots thing wasn't enough of a hot take, I don't know what would be. But I think that we haven't seen anything yet with AI. It's about to be pervasive in ways that are scary, okay, and in parts of people's lives that they haven't seen before. In a way that it's going to be ubiquitous, and that in itself is going to be quite an interesting set of times for us to live in.
Gotcha. Okay. And then what's something that like really irritates you either about this space or just something you have to do that you're like, I hate doing this thing that's part of my job? What's something that sort of grinds you?
I think generally I'm a chief responsible AI officer, so for me, I see a lot of organizations trying to pay lip service after the fact to responsible AI. I think that people see it as, okay, I can do this as a bolt-on. We built all these AI systems, and now we'll put a policy in place that says, okay, we'll definitely do things right. Okay, but they needed to have done them right from the start. They need to do a full assessment of all of this, and people are paying lip service to it and just trying to do it to show that they're good, but they're not. And so when you dig beneath the surface, you realize that not a lot is happening, and that's the vast majority of companies nowadays. And I think that has to change. So that grinds my gears.
Gotcha. And then the last question, what do you enjoy most about
I love learning from people. Okay, I mean, I've learned a lot even from Jacob, from you and I talking today, and just helping me think in different ways. I think for me, with the growth mindset, it's all about trying to learn and understand more about how people are using AI, how the world is working, and I just love that. So for me, my favorite part about what I do is I get to talk to so many different people and have fantastic conversations that I normally wouldn't have done. Okay, and that to me is what makes my life so much richer.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I definitely, learned a lot and have I think a much better understanding of some of these things we talked about. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for having me, Jacob.
Whew. I know it got a little compliance heavy there at the end, but I also think it's really useful to see that the kind of work that is being put into AI safety and ethics is actually beginning to have real impacts by informing the best practices in these standards. If you have enjoyed this episode, think about leaving a review wherever you listen. Like, seriously, from a machine learning perspective, they weight the importance of reviews so much higher than anything else. So it's actually really helpful to get some on there. Just saying. Anyways, on release, Halloween is just around the corner. So, here's a spooky farewell.